All right, I am recording. I imagine somebody will jump on soon, but until then, I'm just going to go over what we're going to be doing today and what we'll be doing next week. Okay, so today is day 50, which means I believe if I did my math right, we are 62.5% of the way through class. All right. Today, we're going to complete the lecture on chapter 12, and we're going to begin to set up the bookstore database. We will not finish it today. All right, tomorrow will be a lab period. I'm not going to do any taping, of course. Monday, we're going to go over the chapter 12 end of chapter project exercise, which is updating the trip log app. That will take the whole period. It is a very extensive example. It'll probably take the whole period. I have changed the due dates on here. All right, and I give you my pledge. I know I've said this before, but I'm telling you, I'm going to be grading tomorrow. So your grades hopefully will be up to date by tomorrow. All right. Your chapters 10 and 11 homework will then be due 4/2. Your chapter 12 homework will be due. I won't make it due on Easter, so we'll make it due the day after Easter. All right. In addition, you probably have already seen this. I sent you another email right before class where I sent you the data files, all right, that we're going to be using in here. Now, I want to mention a couple things about these data files. The first thing is they're not exactly, I didn't set these up exactly the way they are in the book. So when we look at the genre, look in here, where do I have them? Here. So if I look, for example, under author, let's just do the author first. That is going to be set up the way that it is in the book. There'll be an author ID, and then a first name, and then a last name. We're going to set it up exactly that one, exactly the way they did in the book. All right. Then under book, the way the author did it, there is an ID, which will have a title, which will have a price, which will have a genre, which will have, and a genre ID. But in addition to those, the way I set mine up is we're going to have, after the book ID and the title, we'll have the book ID, the title, then the genre ID, then the price, then an image, then a book summary. So that's going to be a little bit different. All right. From there, we're going to go on to the genre, and I believe that's mine will be set up exactly as it was in the book. In other words, there's just we'll put all that in there, including the navigation property. That's totally fine. Plus, we're going to have one more that's sort of mentioned in the book and sort of not mentioned in the book, and that is book authors. All right. And we will set up all of these today. I'm not concerned at all with putting the data in today. I have sent you the data. We will go over that in a bit. All right. In addition, I sent you all of the images today. So you've got all of that stuff. What I want to do first is just pretend we're not even doing a bookstore project yet and just go over the rest of chapter 12. That's what I want to do first. After we get done with going over the material in chapter 12, then we'll backtrack and put in these 4 entity classes. All right. It will be extremely important that before of next week, when I hope to go over chapter 13, that you've read chapter 13. We are going to be adding a ton more folders and a ton more stuff that we have, some of which we've talked about already, some of which we haven't talked about. All right. And we will be doing that stuff, hopefully at least starting Tuesday. Let's just see how it goes. So with that said, all right. there are going to be three entity classes that they show in the book here. And there will be one entity class which is not shown in the book. So they're going to show the author, then the book, then the genre. Okay? All right. And it says that they're using their foreign keys by convention. What that means is, for example, when we look at the genre ID, it's a number. I didn't make mine a number. I made mine a string. So we'll do a little bit of decoration when we get to that point in our setting up the actual model files. Okay. It says it also decorates properties with data attributes for validation. Yeah, we're going to have the validation stuff in there. All right. So we're going to try to follow this as much as I possibly can. All right. Now, for the context class, we're not going to worry about that today either. All right. We're going to be worried about just setting up the 4 database classes. And then we'll talk more about the context class because we're going to set it up differently. And we'll talk about that on Tuesday of next week. So again, on Monday of next week, I will be going over this project, updating the trip log app. All right. And that's 2 pages and then a page of specs. So we're going to be going over all of that. I'd like to do it slowly. I have a tendency when I try to do things too quickly, I miss something or I screw something up. So if we try to dedicate basically the whole period to it, we can get it done. We'll see how that works. All right. We are going to use configuration classes, not today. All right. And what does all that mean? Let's take a look at what's in here. All right. So we're going to have an author class, and our author class, all right, will have an author ID in it. All right. Which will be an integer. That'll be our primary key right here. It will have a first name and a last name. I think 200 characters. Hello, John. I'm just starting to go over, and I mentioned we left off here last time. So this is kind of where I'm picking it up. What we are going to do today is just for a couple minutes or for the first hour, we're going to forget that we're even doing a bookstore website. We're just going to talk about the 4, it'll be entity classes that we'll be creating. 3 of those are shown in the book. So we're going to go over all of those. All right. We'll do that between now and probably around 1 o'clock. Then we'll take a break. And after that, we are going to actually add the entity classes. I based what I did off of what was in the book, but in a couple of the classes, I made changes. We'll explain all of those when we get to that point. All right. I also mentioned that tomorrow, of course, will be our regular Friday lab day. Monday of next week was going to be a lab day, but I flipped it around and made yesterday a lab day. On Monday, I'm going to go over the trip log example that is not there, which is at the end of chapter 12. So our chapter 12 exercise. We are going to update the trip log app so it uses multiple related entries rather than just a single trip entry. Now, when I do that on Monday, and I've mentioned this a little bit earlier, that I have a tendency to try to get too much stuff done too fast, go too fast, mistype, or do whatever. So we're going to take it all and try to see if we can get all of it done on Monday. But if we have to, we'll spend the entire period Monday working on that extended trip app thing. All right, then starting on Tuesday of next week, we will be going over chapter 13. And with chapter 13, it's going to look so different from what we've done in the past. For instance, under our models folder, we're going to have 3 or 4 other folders in there. All right. And we're going to be breaking stuff up into pieces, etc., some of which they start to explain in the chapter here. That's why I do want to go over this. I want to go over all of this chapter, or the rest of this chapter, the last 30 or so pages in the chapter. Then that should bring us up to around break time. Then after the break, we are going to go in and we are going to create 4 entity classes. That's what we're doing today. All right, that'll be it. And if we're done with that by 2 o'clock, then we're done with that by 2 o'clock. All right. Now they talk about a couple of things that are in here. All right. And it'll say the author, book, and genre classes configure their primary keys and foreign keys by convention. What does that mean? All right. Well, when you do something by convention, what it means for your primary key is that you either name your primary key ID, uppercase I, uppercase D, ID, uppercase I, lowercase d, or the name of the table, like author ID. Okay. That's doing things by convention. We're going to try to follow that as much as possible. All right, but there's going to be a few things in here we're either going to change a little bit or we're going to add to try to make sure this works and it works as well as possible. All right, so we'll do some of the validate never, some of the other stuff they talk about here as well. All right, they're also going to show here the bookstore context class in here. And we're going to look at that. We're going to use that as a model, and ours will look very similar to that. Now, with that one, we're going to be using what are called configuration classes. And what that means is this. In the past, basically, what we have done is we have taken all of our seed data, even a lot of tables, and a lot of seed data, and put it all in the same class. We're not going to do that anymore. All right. In fact, we are going to basically put our seed data in these configuration classes. And then in our context class, we're going to be including those files in there. And if you say, I don't get it, we're going to be going over it in just a minute. All right. So as we look in here, here is first, this is the author class. Our author class will be a mirror image almost of this one. I'm literally going to type it in after the break just like this, except for the fact that I think that having a max length of 200 for a first name and a last name is a bit ridiculous. All right, it's a lot more than is needed. Okay, so what I'm planning on just is setting them both up to 50. Other than that, we're going to basically use everything that they show in here. With the remote, we're going to put that in, and that's going to allow us to do some validation on authors to make sure that the author will have a first name and a last name put in, but we won't worry about the implementation of that now. We'll get into that in a later class. All right. One thing that's new in here is we actually have a constructor right in our model. We have not done that before. We've had public class followed by the name of our model class, and then we run right into putting in the ID. We're not doing that here. What we're doing basically is we're setting up a reference here, all right, with a hash set for books. So this is going to allow us to take the authors table and the books table between this and this down here, and it's going to allow us to link them together. If you say how, we're not worried about that for right now. But each author will have an ID. Each author will have a first name, as you can see, required. Again, we'll make it 50, and we will initialize it to string.empty. Same thing with the last name. We will have a method, a read-only method that we'll set up in there so that eventually when we show the author's name, we will concatenate them together. and we will have this skip nav there. All right. And basically, what that allows us to do is it's going to bring in every single field from the books table. All right. But since we're bringing that in and we're not bringing in the primary or that foreign key from the books table, all right, what it's saying is we're basically, it'll work a little better as far as just grabbing the fields we're interested in. And again, with a lot of this stuff, for lack of better words, you'll have to take me at my word right now, and we'll be a lot farther along with this next week at this time. So that's the author class. Then we have the book class. Now, this will be a bit different from what is in here. All right. The first thing you'll notice is when you look at those using statements that are at the top, the second using statement says for validate never. All right. And that means that's going to be used down here. By saying the validate never, we're not going to worry if something is missing. All right. If something is missing, we're not going to worry about it. All right. So we again have a constructor in here where we're binding back to authors. So we had before public author, and then we had here books, new hash set book. Now we're having in book authors, new hash set author. All right. Then we have our ID. Then we're going to have a title. I think that's a little big for a title, but I'll leave it at 200 characters. That's fine. And again, we'll initialize it to string.empty. Now, the next thing that we're going to have in here, just because when I did mine, I guess I did it sort of ass backwards, but I've got the genre ID is in here next. So the order will change. Otherwise, I've got to take this file I gave you and move stuff around. I don't really want to do that. And it won't matter really anyway. So the next field will be the price. And notice in here, all right, they make it a double. I had been previously taking prices and making them a decimal. The reason I think they're using double, I don't know. You know, said this, but the reason I believe they're using double as opposed to decimal is with decimal, you have to put that M at the end of everything, and with double, you don't. All right. Then next, as it says right there, or I said previously, we'll have the genre ID and we'll put in the validate never with genre as well. That's fine. All right. And then again, we've got our collection, our skip nav for authors. Okay. Then next, we've got a genre class. We're basically going to set it up exactly like this is, except for one thing. All right. Um, if you look, we again have a couple things in here. We've got the using ASP.NET Core.MVC as it says for remote, which we'll worry about later. All right. And when you look in here, we've got another constructor. All right. So we're bringing in books with a hash set of type book. Now, the next thing that's in there is it says max length, and it's got a whole bunch of junk in there. All right, you can see it. I'm not going to read any of it to you. You can see all that stuff that's in there. All right, but we are going to set it up. I guess we are going to set it up a lot like they did it here, because we're going to use a string as well. So rather than having the first one is action and adventure, that's the name of the genre. Okay, action, space, and space adventure. But our genre ID is going to be one single word put together, action and adventure. So we're going to set it up just like the one that's shown here. So what I'm telling you is we're going to basically set up out of the ones that you see here, we're going to set up our author almost the same as what's in here. We're going to make a couple changes to our book class. And for our genre class, it'll be set up basically the same. Now, what they do not show in here, what they do not show is there is a fourth entity class. In all of the examples for the books I have given you, all 108 books, we will have a database. They all have one author listed. However, it is totally possible that you could have the same book could have multiple authors. That happens quite often, really. In if you ran a bookstore or whatever, you'd have a lot of books that are written by multiple people. So we are going to create one more table, and that table will be called book author. All right. And it won't have much in it. It's our join or our junction table. So it'll have in it a concatenated primary key of book ID and author ID, and it'll have a couple navigation properties in it, the author and the book. So we'll put that in there as well. But again, when you look in here, this is the bookstore context class. Ours will look like this, but what we've done in the past is we've always taken that data like you see right here, and we've plucked it right in there. We put it in our on model creating right underneath. We're not going to do that. We're going to follow this convention. All right. So the configure genres, the configure books, the configure authors, and the configure book authors, we're going to write those classes. All right. And those classes will be the ones that will actually have our seed data in them. Before class today, I sent you a zipped folder. That zipped folder, rather, has got our information in it. So in other words, it has our authors, and I think there's like 78 of them. All right. Next, it has our books, and there's like 108 of them. Then it has our genres. And I don't remember how many genres there are, but they're I think between 25 and 30. Then I also gave you the book author class, which has for each book, the for each book that is in there, it has the book ID, or in other words, the number of the book, all right, and it has the number of the author that corresponds to that book. We will be creating again a configure authors class that we'll do next week, a configure books class that we'll do next week, a configure genre class that we'll do next week, and a book or configure book author class that we'll do next week. All right. Okay. And there's the book one, there's the genres, and there's the book authors. Okay. So ours will look very similar to this. And again, the main reason that ours is not going to look exactly like theirs is I've taken a true book database, broke it down. So we actually are going to have over 100 books in ours. We are going to have over 70 authors in ours. We are going to have over 25 genres in ours. So when we get to chapter 13 and beyond, we're going to, our database in our application, in my opinion, is going to be much more extensible. All right. It'll be much more reminiscent of a real bookstore. All right. Now it'll be a real bookstore, but it'll be a real bookstore that only has 108 books in it. All right. Or 108 different books. Now we'll have it set up, of course, so that you can add more books. All right. Okay. So they mention here, starting on page 474, that so far in this book, we've used code first development. In other words, we've come in, we've created our model classes, we created our context classes, and our models, they are calling here entity classes, and that's fine. But it says sometimes you want to go the other way around. So what they talk about for the next several pages, we are not going to do this. But they talk about if you could, we went from code to database. They're talking about here how you can go from database to code. All right. So kind of the opposite of what we've been doing. And they mention to get started, you need to use this scaffold DB context command to generate the code. So it's going to write a lot of the code for you. That shouldn't scare you or even surprise you, because when you think about it, What we've been doing so far with our code first is we have had the databases have always been for us. We've created the models, but the database itself and the tables have been created for us. All right. Now, when you do this, some of it is going to look similar to what we've already done, because they mentioned that when you use this scaffold DB command, what you can put in here is this, the connection string, and where you've got the use, wherever it is, that use SQL server thing. We've already been doing that. All right. But when we've been doing it, we've had that information right inside of our app settings.json file. We will create a bookstore context next week. We will do all this stuff. All right. We will call our database bookstore. We will basically, this will be on one line. They've just put it on two lines here, and they put it on two lines for space reasons, but you already know that. We've talked about this before. What's new in here is they're saying that if you want to set this thing up, that you can go out and set it up basically from the PowerShell command, where in other words, you can set it up from the node, or not node, from basically the package manager type of thing that we were using, our node. What is it? I don't know. Where are we here? Our NP, whatever it is. I don't even remember what it stands for right now. But the point is, rather than us creating model classes in a models folder and creating the database off of that, we're assuming we already have a database. All right. And when we do that, we'll be going the other way. Now, you'll notice when you go the other way, all right, that under models, it creates a folder called data layer, and it puts in there your different entity classes and your context class. So this is kind of going to be the start. And what I mean is, with much of the stuff that we're going to be doing in the future, we're going to want to break things up. All right. And we're going to end up under our models folder having other folders. They're just starting to show it. So they mention here, when you use this scaffold database command, it will generate the context file for you and the necessary entity classes based on your database. All right. Now it says when you specify the connection string, it's best to use the connection string that's stored in app settings.json. All right. Now I thought of doing this project and doing it the other way. In other words, going in and doing a database first and then generating the code. With all the problems we've had this semester, I just decided it'd be better to do it the way we've been doing it. All right. So it says here, when you use this scaffold DB context, all right, the connection string, the onConfigure method, it says, contains the connection string and the provider information. It says usually you need to make some adjustments before your project is run. So they show that in here. All right. So in this onConfiguring method, notice what they're doing. They're putting that use SQL server line that we have been using, and they're putting it in the onConfiguring method of your bookstore context class, as opposed to putting it into the program.cs file, which is where we have been putting it so far. We've been doing this that they show down here. They're saying that if you go the other way and you do the database first, you can put it in there. Again, to me, that was just another place where we could have a screw up, and I don't want to screw up. All right. So we're just going to keep doing it the way we've been doing it. All right. And there's a little bit of talk in here, but it's pretty much what I just told you. All right. So how to modify a generated entity class. This is important. All right. It says when you do database first, it's common to enhance it. What does that mean? Well, what happens if you want to add some data validation, or as it says, you want to add more properties like make something read or whatever, but you want to do something. Maybe you even want to add a field or remove a field. All right. It says if you make changes to the database, it's common to need to regenerate the entity classes. When this happens, you lose any additions you've made to the class. All right. This is just another way that another thing where this can screw up. So what you do is you take your class and you break your class that you're working with, that you want to make changes to, you break it into two classes. They both have the same name, but they're both partial classes. All right. So it says there is an entity class named books that's a partial class. All right. Since it's a partial class, as it says there, EF generated in a namespace that corresponds to the folder structure. Then you make another partial class that's got book, it's got the same name. And then what happens is that it takes your original class and it combines the changes you've made and it puts them into a single class called book. So it's like you take half a book plus half a book to make book, for lack of better words. All right. And they mention when you do this, it says there's two things that you have to be leery of. First, it's in the same namespace as the generated class. All right. It says because it has a file with the same name, it must be stored in a different folder, or you have to give it a different name. You can't have basically, an original thing that's called book and an updating thing that's called book unless they're both partial classes. But once you combine them, all right, if you had an original class named book, either you have to remove that class, rename that class, or put your new combined book class into a different folder. That's what they're saying there. Second, it says it adds a read-only property named has title, which indicates whether or not the title property has a value. All right. And it says because this is a custom property, it won't be lost. And they give you some examples. I'm not going to run through these because, again, we're not going to be using this mechanism. I want to talk about it because it's important that you at least hear about it and hear about the fact that there is another way of doing things. All right. So, as they mention here, when the entity framework core generates entity classes, it creates partial classes when you do it this way. If you add data validation or other things, the additions are lost. So to prevent that, you write your own partial classes. All right. It's a little bit quirky. That's why I would strongly suggest we keep doing it the way we've been doing it. All right. And the way that we've been doing it has been rather than database first and then write the code, we have been doing code first and having it write the database for us. All right. So now they go back and there is a little bit of a review on talking about link, and they also talk about um, adding data, updating data, deleting data, etc. All right. So if we take a look at the examples that are here, all right, good, bad, indifferent, it doesn't matter. But what they're trying to show you in many ways here is when you want to do something, there's almost always going to be more than one way of doing it. What do I mean? Well, if you remember, back in the days, it doesn't matter the language. In C sharp, we might have done something like int age, semicolon. Then later on, we might have given age a value. We might have said age equal 21, semicolon. But if we knew the age ahead of time, we would not only say int age, which is our variable declaration, but we would have said int age then equal 21, which would have been our variable initialization. In much the same way, all right, what they're saying here is you could take this line that we've been doing, like a var books equal context.books.toList, and you could break it up into two different lines. All right. The reason that you might want to do that is if there is code that you're going to put in between these two lines that could have some kind of an impact on the query.toList here. If there was, and typically there won't be, they might even be right after one another. So this makes much more sense. It's less typing. And in my opinion, at least, it makes more sense to do it like that. When you start writing these queries, there's a lot of different things that you can do. All right. We've done order bys before. We've done order bys both in SQL Server link using the order by like they show here. We've done order by, for example, last semester, we did it in SQL Server. We did it in MySQL as well. Remember there when you use the order by, like in MySQL, it's two words. Here, there's also an order by descending that we haven't used. Why might you want to do that? Well, in our books database, if we wanted a listing of all the books by price and we wanted the most expensive book first, that would be a way we could do it, as an example. All right. Then they've got some filtering in here. So where it says code that filters the results, we're used to doing most of the filtering that we do. We're used to using a where statement, just like they use here. All right. Now you'll notice that when they're using that where, they have also chained onto that a first or default. All right. And what that means is if there are several things in there that meet our criteria, there probably wouldn't be because you're checking to see for a book ID equal to 1. All right. But if there's several things that meet the criteria, just send us the first one. All right. Otherwise, set the default, which usually, if you're looking for in here, as we found this out in earlier classes, will return 0 if there isn't one that matches. All right. You can use the find as well. And what they're saying is, again, that's a shortcut. It'll do the same thing as the thing below it. All right. Then this get a list of books by genre. This is pretty powerful. All right. This is almost like a select star from books where genre equal mystery. Basically, that's what they're doing right here. You can also do things as they show right here that they're checking books that are more than $10 and less than $20. Since they've got the greater than and the less than without an equal sign in either one, it'll be only books $10.01 up to $19.99. All right. And there's a few other things that are in here, conditionally filtered, so you can have multiple criteria, is what they're saying here. And in here, you can use skip, all right, and skip basically, okay, we are going to end up doing something similar to what they say in here. What they're saying in here is the following. We want to use pagination, and we want it to show 4 books per page. So with what they're showing here, that's going to figure out when to break. So in other words, if we've got 6 pages, page 1 will be books 1 to 4, page 2 will be books 5 to 8, page 3 will be books 9 to 12, etc. All right. This auto tracking, we have not been using tracking all semester, so I'm not going to worry about it. All right. This is kind of neat where it says code that gets a random book. All right. They're using GUI. Sometimes this is called GUID. All right. But usually I call it GUI ID. And it's almost the equivalent of us doing a random type of thing. All right. We're not going to worry about that for now. All right. Then they start getting into talking about projections. And they mention here that a projection uses the select method to retrieve only some of an entity's properties. If you have only, for instance, in our genre, we've only got 2 or 3 properties that are in there. We've got an ID, and we've got a genre ID and a genre name. Well, we can grab everything. In our authors, we've got an author ID, an author first name, and an author last name. That's not bad. All right. But when you get into, for example, talking about a book, now a book has an ID, a title, a genre, a price, an image, and a summary. Maybe you don't want all that stuff. Maybe all you want is the title and the image, or the title and the summary. That's why they're saying that you can use a projection in here for that, to just get what you're looking for. And they mention one way to do that is to use an anonymous type object that they show here. All right, right in here. All right. And the other way that they mention to do this says a better way is to use a simple DTO. That's a data transfer object. It says it's designed to transfer data from one place to another. All right. It says, for example, in the second set of examples, it says it provides a value in text for a drop-down list. All right. It says this allows the select method to create a new instance of the DTO rather than creating an instance of an anonymous type. Why? Because when you pass that to the view, it's again going to be able to use the IntelliSense with it. All right. And believe it or not, we actually did a little bit of that in the example that we went over the other day. All right. Next, they mention here, in addition to limiting the properties that are returned, you sometimes need to include the data for related entities in your query. To do this, as it says, you can use the include and then include methods. We have been using the include method almost all semester. All right. So that really isn't anything new. When you look in here, we've been doing stuff like this, dot include whatever. So they mention here, a projection again allows you to retrieve just a subset, not every property that's in the entity class. All right. Again, you can use an anonymous type. All right. As it says, it can be hard to use in views because again, you don't get the IntelliSense. All right. You can use include and then include to include related entries in a query. As it says, these methods accept lambda expressions. This is a lambda expression. Anytime you've got something followed by an equal and a greater than, where it looks like one of the arrow functions from last semester, that's a lambda expression. All right. Next, they go in here and they talk about how to insert, update, and delete data. Some of this stuff we have talked about already. You have used this already. You've done an add, you've done an update, you've done a remove. And afterwards, you've done a save changes to save what you're working on. What they're doing here is they're trying to explain them in more detail. So as it says right here, the add, the update, and the remove methods affect the DB set. All right. It says it marks a new entity as being added or updated or removed. But until you do the same changes, it is not written back to the database. And that's what they're mentioning in here. All right. As it says, when you call this method, all of the added, modified, and deleted actions pending in the DB set properties are executed against the database. That does not necessarily mean they will work, because if you did something illegal in an add or an update or a delete, such as trying to add a record that already exists, trying to modify a record that doesn't exist, trying to delete a record that doesn't exist. In those cases, exceptions will be thrown. All right. So that's a little bit more beyond the scope of this class. But again, if that's the thing, if you were worried about that, there'd be even more code that you'd have to be adding into your application. All right. And that's a lot of that is pretty much what we've been talking about all semester. Now, they do mention in here, it says when it comes to updates, the second example shows how to work with a disconnected scenario because it's commonly used with web apps. In here, the edit gets the book entity from a post request. As a result, it says you must use update to update the state before calling changes. With desktop apps, it's more common to use a connected scenario. All right. What's the big difference here? If you're using a desktop app, the chances are better you're the only one using it. If you're using a web app, it might be you and everybody else who works at your company. So there's much more work that you have to do with a disconnected type of scenario to make sure that there aren't overwrites and there aren't concurrency problems, which we're going to see in just a couple minutes. Says there, finally, when you delete a parent entity in EF, it is common for all of the related child's entities to be deleted also. That again may or may not be what you want, because if it deletes it, if it deletes all of those, so if we deleted a genre, then every book in that genre would be deleted. All right, that may or may not be what you want. It says you can disable this as described earlier in the chapter. We did talk about it before, but basically if you turn that off, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, if we attempt to remove that, if we, for example, if we attempt to remove a genre and there are still books existing with that genre in it, it'll throw an exception and we'll have to handle it in our code. So again, these are the three methods that they were talking about. We have used all of these before. We have also used the save changes before. And they give you some examples. You'll notice that in all these cases, it's happening in an add or in an edit, but in all cases, it is happening in an HTTP post. Because again, remember that when you use an HTTP GET, it's what we referred to in an earlier chapter as being idempotent. In other words, it's not going to be allowed to change anything. So not all, but most of the rest of the chapter here is going to talk about concurrency conflicts. A concurrency conflict wouldn't exist for us because we each have our own copy of the database. However, if you can imagine that we were all working where our database existed on a server someplace, and whenever we wanted to do anything, let's assume for a second, each and every one of us is an administrator. All right. And if two of us want to update the same record at the same time, there can be a problem that happens. That's called the concurrency conflict. The worst way to handle this is the first way they mentioned. That's called last in wins. So, John, imagine you and I both try to bring up the same record. Each get a copy of it before it's been changed. All right. Let's say that it is a book record. And the book is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I spelled it wrong. It says The Boy in the Stripped Pajamas, as an example. So I change it. While I'm changing it, you go in and you change the price from $53.99 to $63.99. If I save mine and then you save yours after mine, my change is lost. If you save yours first, then I change and save mine, your change is lost. That's why it's called last in wins. It doesn't perform any kind of checking. It just takes the latest one and it uses that. All right. But as they mentioned there, that can lead to corrupted data. All right. The other thing is called optimistic concurrency. And when that happens, if somebody has a record that they're updating and somebody else, all right, comes up and starts to update that same record, what's going to happen is either user, when they attempt to save what they're working on, it's not going to work. It's going to throw an exception. All right. And basically, it'll say something like record being used, try again later. All right. All right. They go in next and they talk about how you can check for these concurrency conflicts. I'm not going to spend really any time on this because, again, this would make a lot of sense if we were all using the same copy of the same database. Since we each have our own copy, this doesn't really make a lot of sense to go over. All right. And really, what we'd have to do we'd have to do some of the stuff they talk about in here, where we'd have to basically fake something to give us an error. All right. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do that. All right. If you do work in a situation where there's multiple people using the same thing and you get this concurrency exception, here they're telling you to do it. All right. And notice it's in a try catch block and notice what you're catching here. All right. DB update concurrency exception. So you'd have your choice over how you would want to handle this. As they say here, it's thrown when there's a concurrency conflict. It has an entries property that provides a way to get new database values for the row that's being saved. All right. Okay. And the last thing that's discussed in this chapter, we're going to get to it right now, and that is how to encapsulate your EF code. In fact, I'll tell you what, I said we go till 1. Let's take right now, it's 12:57. Let's take till 1:10, so 13 minutes. Then I want to go over these last 5 or 6 pages that are in the chapter. After we get done with those, we're immediately going to go in and we're going to create a new project. And in our models folder, we're going to create the 4 entity classes. So it's just about 12:58, but please let's come back at 1:10 and we'll finish the chapter up at that time. Gotta get a drink. I'll be right back. All right, it is 1:10, so I'm going to continue on. And there's about 6 or 7 pages left in the chapter, so we'll finish those in 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to create the 4 entity class. We'll create a new project, create the 4 entity classes in our models folder, and that'll be it for today. We'll pick that up on Tuesday. Again, on Monday, we're going to go through the not the case study, but the project for 12.1, which is the extended trip app. All right. And what they're saying in here, if you look at this, I don't want to read to you, but so far, much of the stuff we've been doing has been code that's been put in the controller. And as they say, typically you wouldn't put that code in the controller, it would be in its own data layer. All right. And the idea behind this is truly what we want to do is MVC, or Model View Controller. So by taking the code that we had been putting in the controller and basically moving it over and putting it inside of the models folder will mean what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to have all of our model stuff together. All right. Not only does it make it easier to test because it's in one area, but typically it's going to be one part of the company that will be doing that test. All right. It says it also allows you, if you want to, you can store your data access code in another project. Because if your project gets really big, all right, then it might take a long time to load or whatever. Finally, as it says, if you decide you're going to change from EF Core to something else, you can do it without it affecting the rest of your code. Now, I want to show you something, and I'm going to do this quickly. What I'm about to show you, you already have. This is chapter 13 from your book. This is the book app, chapter 13, bookstore. Don't worry about it because we're building our own. All right. But if I look here and I double click on it, you'll notice that in chapter 14, we're going to implement an admin area because again, it should only be admins that should be able to go in and either add a new author or add a new book or add a new genre or delete one of them or make updates. So we'll talk about that in a later chapter. And in our controllers, well, we're still going to have our home controller and a controller for, you know, our authors and for our books. And eventually we're going to bring the shopping cart in here. All right. Well, that's, every time we do an add migration, but here's where it changes. Look at this. Our models, now look at what they have in here. We have 6 folders in here. We've got one that's called data layer, and that's what we just mentioned. It will have these repositories in it. Notice seed data and a bunch of other stuff. All right. Then we're going to have a folder called domain models. That's where what we've been putting in our regular models folder. So in just a little bit, under our models folder, we're going to create a folder called domain models, and we're going to put in there an author.cs, a book.cs, a genre.cs, and a book author.cs. We won't worry about putting the data in, but we will build the structure for each one of those. All right. Then next, you've got these data transfer objects that we talked about. All right. This is going to get a lot harder before it gets easier. All right. Then we've got extension methods that we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. Then you've got a thing, this is the grid where we're actually going to be building, kind of building the interface. All right. And these will be our view models. So you can see that we're going from what we had originally, which was under models, we would have like one model. All right. And then we brought in the context file, and now it's getting exploded into 6 different folders, each of which is are in kind of their own pieces, so to speak. All right. And that's what we're moving toward. So there's a bunch of examples in here on how to do this and why to do it. I don't really think it's going to make a lot of sense now for us to go through these examples. All right. But they do mention here, it's good practice to encapsulate the code. What does that mean? Remember, encapsulation basically means data hiding. All right. So what they're saying is, if I can take the code that basically works with the data and hide it, and I just make sure that somebody else knows how to use it, then I'm better off because they can't screw it up. All right. So again, to do that, we will code data access classes. And as it says, to make these classes more flexible, we'll code them with methods that accept link expressions as arguments. All right. That's of AWD1000. And I know you guys had Evan for that, but I'm sure that towards the end, sometime when you were in the JavaScript portion, you talked about the fact that JavaScript is a little different in that you can use a function like a variable. That's kind of what we're doing here. But rather than using it as a variable, all right, as it just said right here, all right, we can code it with methods that accept link expressions as arguments. The advantage to doing that is that those can change on the fly. So I can call the same thing multiple times, and for example, pass it different authors or different genres or different books, all right, to get different results back every time. All right. There's a couple definitions that are in here that right now probably won't make a lot of sense, but hopefully they will when we move on. All right. Such as, all right, they mention in here, it says this figure shows how to add an extension method to the iQueryable interface. You might want to do this for operations that you perform frequently, like paging. An extension method is similar to a regular method, except it's defined outside of the data type that it's used with. So it's something that's going to be used in conjunction with something else. But again, we're talking about doing a lot of segregation here of our code and not integration. We're talking about moving things. So what we're doing, we're moving it into its own area, for lack of better words. All right. And finally, the last thing that's discussed in the chapter here on page 494 is they start talking about how to use what are called repository patterns. And again, my hope is this stuff will make more sense and we can come back to it, but we're going to get this in more detail in chapter 13. It says there that this pattern encapsulates data code within a data access layer and also uses interfaces to provide some abstraction. All right, it says one benefit is it makes it easier for testing, and testing is what chapter 14 is about. And again, they give you some examples of this, but since we haven't really dealt with it, they're not going to make a whole boatload of sense, at least as of right now. All right. So that's what I had for chapter 12. Again, on Monday of next week, on Monday, what we're going to do is we're going to go and look at that extended trip app. But what I want us to do now, if you would please, is I want you to start up Visual Studio Code right now, please. And as we've done basically all semester, all right, here and create a new project. As always, it'll be C#, Windows, and Web. Up here, I'll put in model again. Make sure it's the C# one, and it is. Click next. And I'm going to call this bookstore. Just call it what it is. And I'm going to make a bookstore folder out here, right out here as well. So bookstore. I'm just going to call everything bookstore. So I made a folder out on my desktop that's called bookstore. All right. And I'm making a project with a name of bookstore, and the solution will be named bookstore as well. All right. I'm going to say next. For right now, for the authentication, I think we can go back and add this later. I'm hoping so, at least. I'm just going to click create. You know what happens here, nothing big. All right, I'm going to close this overview page, but now we're going to do something we haven't done before, and that is I want you to go into your models folder, and I want you to right mouse click on it and choose add new folder. So we're making a folder under our models folder, and that will be called data models. Put it together like it's one word, but with a capital D and a capital M. And this is where we're going to create our entity classes, is here under data models. So let's do that right now. We'll start with author. So right mouse click on there, choose add class. All right. And we're going to put in author.cs. All right. And now I'm going to base this almost exclusively off of what's in the book. So I'm going to start by coming up to the top here. You move this over. So I'm sure I have plenty of room. There. All right. And I'm going to put in some using statements. So using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC, and then another using system.collections.link. Oh, not link, generic. Sorry. You'll see why that is hopefully in a moment. All right. And what else? Using system dot component model dot data annotations. Those three. All right. Okay. Now I'm looking in here. We may have to change this. This is how I've written it. I'm going to try to do some work with it this weekend. We may have to make some changes. That's why we're not going to add the data yet. We're not going to come into the NuGet package manager and set that stuff up yet. We'll do all that next week. All right. But for now, we're going to just do it like this. All right. So taking it from the top then, I'm going to put in the primary key. So public int author ID with our get set. All right. Next, we want to put in here, again, this is an author, and all we want to add to this is a first name and a last name. Okay. But we want to make them both required, and we want to give our own error messages. I told you before, I thought that a max length of about 50 should be sufficient. All right. So there is the first one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this because the other one is last name. So I'm just going to copy it and put it right below it. And then make this one, please enter author last name. And change this to last name. Okay. Now, name, we're also going to come in here and we're going to add a remote property because later we're going to add some validation. This is all going to be shown in the book. So that's calling something we haven't written. Make this a lot smaller so you'll be able to keep seeing it as I keep typing. There we go. All right, so that'll handle that. Next, we will come in here and we will have a read-only property. And that's going to be that public string full name. And what we're doing in there then is we will be coming in and concatenating our first name with a space and then our last name like that. And finally, we're going to add a navigation property. Now we're getting that error because we didn't make the book author yet. That has not been made. We're going to make that in just a moment. So don't worry about the fact showing us that in error. It is okay. The other things that are in here, I don't know if we're going to want to put a question mark here and here. If we do put a question mark here and here, those warnings will both go away. All right. I'm not sure yet if we'll want it or not. So I'm just going to leave it off for now. Okay. All right. So that's the first one. Hopefully you've had time enough to put that in. I'm going to do a file save all. And I'll tell you what, just so we can see if we can make that error go away, let's do the book author next. All right. So let's right mouse click on our data models, add class. We are going to call that class book author. Again, one word, big capital B, little OK, capital A, little UTHOR.CS. Book author right there, just like that. And that's going to be pretty simple. All right. We don't have any using, we don't have anything in there. All right. But we do have a composite or a concatenated primary key. So that'll be made of a public int book ID with a get set, public int with an author ID and a get set, and then two navigation properties. Public author with a get set, and public book and one book author book with a get set. Now we're getting an error there because we haven't created book yet. We will in just a moment. However, when we go back to author now, that error that we had in there is now gone. All right. So we now have our author class and we have our book author class. All right. That's two of the four that we need. Okay. So next, let's try to fix that one. So we will come in and create our book class. So let's right mouse click again on data models, add class. This will be book.cs. All right, notice just putting that in there, when I go back to book authors, that error is now gone. All right, so let's go to here and we'll do this one now. And again, this is based off of the one that was in the book, but I made a couple of my own changes to it. So using system.collections.generic and using system.components model.data annotations. All right. This is the biggest one that we have to do. When we're done with this, we'll do the genre and we'll be done for the period. All right. So they showed this in the book as being a partial class, but I believe that's because they're doing it as a database first. So I don't think we need to make ours that way. Now, that's why, like I said, I've got to do more work on this weekend. That's why I didn't want us to go any farther than this. So, all right. Then after the book ID, the next thing we want in there is a title. All right. But with that title, we want it required. And we want there to be an error message in there. All right. So required error message equal, please enter book title. Okay. Probably spell that right. That would be nice, wouldn't it? There we go. All right. And we will put in, we'll leave what the author had, which was a max length of 200. All right. And then public string title. So far we've got the ID and we've got the title. The next one I put in there was genre ID. I wish I'd done a better job of putting this in the right order. I did not. So we're going to put in next foreign key property. Again, it will be required. And again, we will have an error message that says, please enter a book genre. And that will be public string genre ID. Again, with a get set. Okay. So after genre, so far we've got the ID, the title, and the genre. So next we need the price. And let's see, how do we do that? Well, it's been a while since I've done a thing with price. All right, but it's going to be a number. So that's going to be a greater than. We'll have to modify this, but for now, I'm just going to put it in like this. All right. Let's see. I think it just goes like this range, and we want it to go from 0.0, and I don't know what the maximum value is going to be for a book. Let's say $1 million. All right. Kind of stupid, but maybe there would be some special book that was. We'll put an error message in there that is equal to price must be between, let's just say it must be greater than 0 or more than 0. That'll be cool. That'll be fine. So the price must be more than 0. And we will again put a public double here for price with our get set. All right. And finally, we will add a navigation property here. 2 of them. Public genre get set. That's giving us an error because we didn't add the genre yet. We'll do that in a minute. Public I collection, book author, and we will call this one book authors. All right. And let's do a file save all. And let's get rid of this error right now for the genre. This is amongst the easiest ones that we have to put in here. It's only got an ID and a name. But again, with the ID is going to be a string. All right, so let's come in and add one more thing into our data models. So I'm going to again right mouse click on here, choose add, choose class, and this will be genre, GENRE.cs. And let's put this in. Again, a couple using statements at the top. And because I like to put things in alphabetic order. All right. let's see. I'm going to put in here, we'll put in a max length. I don't think we really need it, but I'm going to put it in anyway. In the book, they're showing this field as being a string like we have, but they're making it size 10. I'm going to make it 100. We will have a remote statement in here. This is something, again, we're going to be checking later. And what we're doing here, just so you know, what we're letting this in here know, it needs a double quote there, is that we're going to have a validation for this, and that will be located in the admin area. All right, just so you knew that. All right, and each genre must have a name. So I'm going to give this a string length of 100. Again, it's going to be required. And finally, we'll have a navigation property. Book, books, and it'll have a get set. That is everything for right now. All right. Now, I'm not saying this is homework, but I'm going to ask that for next week, you do two things. It is now my responsibility that tomorrow morning, I want to grade everything that you have. Your tests have all been graded, but I have not graded your written tests, your labs, which, your homework, your case study, and your projects. I want to grade all of those tomorrow morning. All right. But I think it was 8-1. I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure it was 8-1, where we developed this trip app, the first trip app. There it is. Build a trip app log. So I'm taking for granted that you will have your trip app done by Monday, because we're actually going to build a separate database. I think we call the first one like trip log or something like that. And we'll call this second one, just to keep it simple, like trip log 2. But we're going to be building off of this example that we did earlier. So that's the first thing. So for Monday, please take the time to go out and make sure that your project 8-1 is finished. All right. And then secondly, and I know I already mentioned this, but I'm saying it again anyway. Starting on Tuesday, if we get everything I want to get done on Monday, we're going to be going over this. As it says, the bookstore website presented in this chapter is a realistic website that uses everything we've gone through so far in this book. Due to space limitations, this chapter doesn't present every line of code for the website, However, all of the code is available with the book's download. So we are going to go in there and again, notice there's going to be a folder structure that's going to be set up in here. We will talk extension methods. We will talk query option class, repository class, how to set up our grid for this. So there's a lot of stuff. And then for the first time, we're going to also be bringing in this cart page. It's about 50 pages. I'm going to really go slow with it. So my hope is if we finish on Monday, if we finish this trip apps, then we can take Tuesday and Wednesday to go over this and make sure we've got it all down up till that point. Also, if you look for chapter 13 on here, if I go back to the top, chapter 13, there is one problem. They want you to go back to the quarterly sales app and add paging and sorting, etc. And if you look here, there is nothing assigned for the case study. All right. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. All right. I'll be online tomorrow, all period. If you have any questions or anything I can help you with. But again, I am promising you that what I'm planning on doing right now, unless something totally unforeseen comes up, which I don't imagine, is that starting at 8 a.m. tomorrow, I'm going to be grading. So you should see everything that you've turned in should be graded. All right. So please try to make sure that everything you've got done is in your repo because I pull your repos down, make copies of them, and base everything off of that. That's all I've got, unless you or anybody has any questions. All right. I will talk to you then on Monday. Have a good weekend.